Hi, everyone. A lot of familiar faces I haven't seen in a while, so it feels good to connect. As AJ said, my name is Katie Fiorillo Dowhaniuk. It's a mouthful of a name, so no worries on pronouncing it right, AJ. And I am a fourth semester, so last semester MDP student. And this is a presentation on my preliminary results for my field practicum. I am calling in from northern Uganda right now, where my husband and I just moved to a few weeks ago. So I'm hoping my internet holds up well, but in case it doesn't, I've asked Medha to just put in the chat the last thing she heard me say so that we don't lose a lot of time saying, oh, can you hear me? Oh, what was the last thing you heard? And all that. So hopefully this goes smoothly. The internet seems to be working well for now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see that okay? Yes, great. So the title of my field practicum was Measuring Women's Empowerment in Agroforestry Activities in Northern Uganda with Kijani Forestry. It's a very long name for a field practicum. The Uganda version of an IRB is called a Regional Ethics Committee, gave me a lot of input, a lot of which was around the name, and they requested it to be this long. So that's the name. So I first have to start my presentation with a big thank you to the people who supported my research this past summer, namely my host organization and my current employer, Kijani Forestry, as well as the Masters of Sustainable Development Practice Program, the Center for African Studies, and the Tropical Conservation and Development Program, which we all know of. We're all a massive part of making sure that this research was able to happen, especially during a summer that still had COVID going on, as is now. So a big thank you to all of these entities for helping me to conduct this research, and I'm really excited to share some preliminary results from that. Another big thank you before I launch into sort of more details is to my team. So here you'll see the two people in red are two of Kijani's extension workers. They work in the sub-county that was targeted for this research project, Precious and Eric. They were helping my whole team and myself get to know where all the farmer groups were and how to move around, and gave us a lot of advice and facilitated our community entry very smoothly. So a big thank you to them. And then the other four, Charles, Susan, and Paul were my team of enumerators that were trained and hired for the summer. They went through a lot to help me get this research done, including a COVID lockdown and a lot of long field days. So I appreciate them very much for their contribution to the work. So can you guys hear the dogs barking outside, or is it okay? It's fine? Cool, okay. They're like right outside the window, so I hope. So yes, my research took place in Gulu district, northern Uganda. So as you can see, zoomed in on the right side were the places that the groups were actually meeting. So it kind of shows a disbursement of the groups that were targeted for this research intervention, as well as the town of Gulu, where I lived, and Kijani's farm, which you'll see in the upper right corner. So these are all the groups that Kijani works with in this specific sub-county of Gulu. So why this research? Why did I want to take this on? And even getting at the title, I'm sure you can imagine it's about measuring women's empowerment. So Kijani operates an outgrower model with smallholder farmers to establish sustainable fuel woodlots on farmers' private land to grow trees for fuel wood and timber that Kijani then harvests and produce sustainable charcoal using highly efficient production methods, as well as providing access to a market for timber and charcoal. So we work with all these groups. We're growing rapidly every year. Our first year we planted 100,000 trees. in 2020. In 2021, that number is just under 1 million. And this year we're scaling to plant 7 million trees with 5,000 farmers. So we're growing really, really fast, and we have a lot of talent on our team, especially in the agroforestry space. However, as a gender in development enthusiast, I wanted to make sure that as we're scaling really fast and growing rapidly and working with more and more people, that we're applying a gender lens that is grounded in the cultural context of the people we're working with, and ensuring that we are not creating negative unintended consequences, which happens a lot in the development space, especially around gender. So the purpose of this research was to establish a robust baseline of women's empowerment among a variety of indicators that I'll get into later in this presentation, so that we can understand as we develop our program that we're targeting appropriately and that we are having a measurable impact and improvement. We want to improve women's lives as well as all rural farmers, but specifically, making sure at the very least we're avoiding negative unintended consequences, but at the very best, hopefully helping these women achieve higher levels of empowerment. So this is just a few of Kajani's farmers working, as you can see, they're all women in this photo, working on the first step of our process, which is called potting, which I'll get into a little later on, but is relevant as far as looking at women's participation in this value chain. And we plant trees, obviously, so looking at how women and men engage in agroforestry, and if there's any differences, wondering if there were differences in species preference or purpose for planting or anything like that. So just exploring a few of those things through my research this summer. So my research is based off of Naila Kabir's model of empowerment, the combination of resources, agency, and achievements. My research did focus a little bit more on agency, hence it being highlighted this past summer. So the capacity to define one's own goals and make strategic choices in those goals, particularly where that ability was previously denied. Uganda is a very patriarchal society historically. So a lot of those rights have only been realized by women in more recent years. So looking at it in that context. So I used a mixed method approach of quantitative and qualitative data. I used the validated tool developed by IFRI and USAID for Feed the Future that was then adapted by lots of iterations later, the project level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or the PRO-WIA, was the quantitative tool that I used. And my enumerators that you saw on the first slide were all trained on how to use the tool over a week-long training period, followed by a few practice sessions. And then they collected data from 186 farmers over the course of the summer. So we'll get into a little bit of the quantitative data, but essentially the WIA looks at the PRO-WIA looks at 3 types of power or agency: intrinsic agency, or the power within; power to, or instrumental agency, ability to do things; and power with, collective agency, which is seen a lot in the form of the power of a group, power of people and their collective action, things like that. So the PRO-WIA has indicators associated with all of these 3 types of agency that are then administered in the form of a survey and then can be analyzed for data to produce a WIA score, or a Women's Empowerment in Agriculture score. So there are 12 indicators that make up all of this. I am still working through getting through it. I have 3 indicators remaining to fully analyze, so you will not see the full PRO-WIA. I am very new to Stata and R and all of those sort of coding softwares, so it's taking me a lot longer than anticipated to get through all of the data, but I still wanted to hold my Tropilunch date, so I decided to just present what I have. Hear your feedback. This is a collaborative space, I hope. And then I will have the rest of the results hopefully in a few days. So very preliminary results. All of these indicators you can see listed here are the 12 indicators that were shown on this slide. As you can see, 3 of them are still TBD. But lines that are blue indicate that the percentage of individuals in that indicator, there was no gender difference in the level of empowerment. And then green indicates if it was a man or a woman, that men or women overall that were more empowered in that indicator, and red is that they are less empowered in that indicator. So autonomy and income and visiting important locations were both equal across genders. So I find this like really interesting because I think with the tool and in this space, a lot of people assume that across the board, women will be less empowered. And it was interesting to see that not only are they equal in these two indicators, but they're actually quite high in the level of empowerment that they have, especially visiting important locations. It was 100% empowerment or reaching adequacy in that indicator. So this is for a variety of reasons. I do believe that selection bias in the population that I picked for this indicator, especially in the visiting important locations, had a huge influence. While it was rural from Gulu town, the town center of Awach, which is the sub-county I chose to work in, is rapidly developing. It's going to be the new district headquarters, and they have a really good hospital. Pretty much everything's walking distance. So even though, like feasibly walking distance, we traveled everyone on a motorcycle and a car and it felt really far, but people theoretically have walking access to all of the quote important locations, including churches, hospitals, health centers, things like that, and the market. So across the board, everyone was very empowered when it came to their movement, especially within their community and visiting important locations. And then as far as autonomy and income, I think this is an interesting thing to examine when looking at while they're not urban by any means, it's still pretty close to a large town. Gulu is one of the largest cities in Uganda after Kampala and Entebbe, and Awach is like less than an hour outside of it. So that could also be speaking to a bit of the rural-urban divide in things like income. And then there are a few indicators that women, actually more of them were adequate than men, a higher percentage, including self-efficacy and respect among household members. So we'll get in a little bit into those two indicators where actually came out as well in the qualitative data that I'm going to dive a little into later on. But then when it came to things like ownership of land and assets, men were across the board empowered as far as owning everything in the household. Women were a lot lower. Women traditionally do not have land ownership rights as often as men. They're not part of the inheritance. When they marry into a family, they don't necessarily get title of that family's land, and they're not entitled to their family's land as it is passed along the male line. So that was a little bit to be expected. Work balance, shocker, women were not super empowered or adequate in that indicator. Women take on a vast majority of the domestic and actually the productive activities in this community, whereas men seem to have a lot more free time and had a better work balance. Group membership was interesting to see. The men were a bit more empowered in those categories, membership in influential groups and both group membership, as groups are seen as a women's thing in some spaces, especially in Uganda, where there's a lot of women savings groups and things like that. However, I think especially over the last few years, men have also come to see the value in group membership and the collective agency that it can provide. So I think their membership has also gone up. Any questions so far? Let me know if I'm talking too fast or if you can still hear me, that my internet didn't go out. Good.
Yeah, it's going great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you probably don't know me. I'm Trent Blair. I'm based near Miami, but I'm curious why the number of respondents changed a lot, because you have like from 155 to 54.
I'm sorry. Yes, that is this is only looking at the people that were adequate in that indicator. Great question. So when I was doing all the math, I was like, wait, is this right? So overall, for example, you'll see in visiting important locations, 100% of the women and 100% of the men were adequate in that indicator. So 100% is 165 people were actually used for the analysis. We interviewed 186, but for a variety of reasons, including improper coding, things like that, only 165 are included in the analysis. So overall, in that indicator, for example, work balance, only 35% of the 165 participants were actually adequate in that work balance indicator, which means that they are working an average of 10.5 hours in a day and have ample time for both sleep and for their own personal activities. So only 35% overall of people that were interviewed were actually adequate in that indicator, hence the N equals 57.
That makes a lot of sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Cool, okay. So something that I'm currently going through the analysis of is there was some participant selection bias when looking at productive activities and productive decisions in the term or in the realm of tree planting. So we did target active participants in Kajani's program to be included in the population for the survey. There's no control group of like a different community that doesn't work with Kajani. So removing that activity of tree planting, which a lot of them did participate in, at least one person in every household. I mean, in a few households, both members were participating and had high levels of empowerment in their decision-making ability in that activity. They were making decisions together, felt like they had a lot of input, was specific to that tree planting activity. So another further analysis that I wanted to do is actually pull that activity out of the survey and see if there's any difference in the number of people that are adequate in that indicator if tree planting were not to be included in the survey, just to see if there's any sort of difference that tree planting is making, which would be a proxy for working with Kajani, because we're a tree planting company. So there are limits to this data. Unfortunately, I was in Uganda for like 4 months over the summer, and 3.5 of those months was a COVID lockdown, which meant that I did not go anywhere that I could not ride my bicycle or walk, as all forms of transportation, including driving your own vehicle, was banned for 3 months. So I got there, trained my team, we mobilized the community, had a whole plan for conducting all of these surveys, had all of our approvals, and then bam, lockdown. So there was a significant lag between the training and the mobilization of the community to the actual implementation of the survey in the community. And I think I only got like 1 week done of supervising my enumerators while I was in Uganda before I had to come back to start classes. So a lot of the surveys, or my team conducted the surveys while I was already back in the States. This led to a few errors in data, including household IDs, which was tying the male and the female head of household together so that you could run analysis on differences in answers at the household level between men and women versus just overall men and overall women. Not all of those were submitted correctly, which led to a drop in the number of observations that could be included in the survey. And we did not necessarily count when making those IDs for households that had both the man and the women actively participating in Kajani's activities. So I made the wrong assumption that only one person from every household was like the main member in Kajani's groups. And we found that that wasn't the case. So they had different IDs, and it's been a challenge sort of linking them all together for the analysis at the household level, but we've still been able to do the comparing all men and comparing all women. So I conducted I used a variety of different methods for my qualitative data, including key informant interviews. I interviewed 4 Kajani staff members, our director of charcoal, who is a man, our regional coordinator, who's a woman, our district coordinator, who's also a woman, and a community coordinator, also a woman, and then one village chief from the community that I was working in, who was a man. And this was just people who, after talking to a variety of people, felt that they had a good understanding of what was happening on the ground and had valuable insight to provide. So some demonstrative quotes that I've just plucked from these key informant interviews just to get the discussion started on what a lot of this qualitative data found was that women have now taken on a role of responsibility over their families. You find that the mother is the overall breadwinner of the family versus the father. And with this empowerment, women are misusing it. They end up not being obedient to their husbands. And what the men do now is to withdraw because the woman thinks that she can handle herself and her family. So this starts to hint a little bit at some findings I found in focus groups as well, is that the gender norms in this culture have shifted over the last few years, and that men, typically the breadwinner, typically doing all economic activities, bringing in all the money, things like that, are not necessarily holding that role anymore, and that it's shifting more and more to women. And we can get into a little bit why, maybe in a discussion afterwards, but also with that, the misusing it and being obedient to not being obedient to husbands is speaking a little bit to the male backlash that is occurring because of that shift of gender norms, where the men no longer have their traditional role or it's being threatened, and their reaction to that is backlash or to withdraw from their family or to withdraw from responsibility and push it all on the woman instead of sort of embracing it as a couple and equal responsibility, 50-50 split. I also conducted 3 focus group discussions, one with a female charcoal producer group. So I mentioned earlier that Kajani plants trees to establish fuel wood lots that are then used for charcoal production. So this is a group of women, which is rare, that is producing charcoal already, and Kajani buys from them. They're part of our value chain. Charcoal production is very typically a male activity in Uganda. It's very labor intensive. It involves harvesting trees, carrying large, heavy pieces of wood, managing a burning kiln, things like that. So it's typically a male activity. As women, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy or strength. So it's typically a male activity, but I found this female charcoal producer group and just thought that was really interesting that they were working with Kajani already, and they were part of the focus group discussion to understand the gendered participation in the value chain and how that varies at each node, as well as 2 gender disaggregated Kijani participant groups, one with all women and one with all men. This is Esther, who gave her consent to be included in this presentation. She's the chairwoman of the Maditam Women's Savings Group in Teokuru Gwandia in Gulu. So there were several themes that came out during my analysis of this qualitative data. I recorded everything, audio, transcribed it, and then used thematic analysis to draw out some themes that were emerging from the data, as well as using the Kabir's framework and the ProWIA framework of resources, agency, and achievement to understand sort of the data a little bit. But some emergent themes were looking at the local definition of empowerment that was coming out during these focus groups, the changing role of women in the household, which we already saw a quote about from the key informant interviews, as well as autonomy of women. But then looking a little bit into male alcohol abuse in the community, as well as the hegemonic masculinities that are related to that. And then a look at the gender division of labor, including a value chain analysis, looking at agroforestry and charcoal production, as well as people's motivation to plant trees. Like, I just wanted to know, like, why are you planting trees with Kajani? I work for Kajani. I'm interested in understanding how we can do better. So why are you planting trees? So the first focus group with all women included an activity that was to draw what they felt was an empowered woman. So I find this was super interesting. This group was really, really active, really excited. They were supposed to sort of draw one as a group, and then they all got really excited and all wanted to draw their own. So these are just a few of them. But as you can see, you see a lot of similarities emerge. Almost, I don't know, can you guys see my mouse on this? Yes? No? Okay, well, if you were to look at the blue drawings, you can see the sort of lines drawn on the head. Those are representing braids. Ugandan women that have braids in their hair is a sign of like status in the community, as if they have their hair braided or have braids in their hair. You can also see there's a lot of agricultural activity taking place, a lot of people planting, you can see watering or digging. There's also in blue, a lot of trees. Those are little trees growing, which I thought was really cool. They felt that empowered women were planting trees, which was very nice to hear. As well as there's a lot of multitasking going on. A lot of either women that are pregnant and working, or carrying children on their back, or carrying something on their head, as well as cooking. So this were all things that women in the community were saying is what their definition of an empowered woman would look like. They also then felt that drawing was not enough to convey their view of an empowered woman, and humbly requested to perform a impromptu drama, which was lovely, and involved the chairwoman of the group organizing a bunch of them very quickly to act like oxen, and she was driving the oxen to plow her field, which was cool because it spoke to having the resources to actually hire an oxen plow to plow her field, get things done. They also showed a disempowered woman in the drama that was planting trees by herself and not using the correct spacing or the right tools, meaning she didn't have the knowledge from being in the group on how to plant trees and was doing it by herself. And then they contrasted that with an empowered woman was planting trees correctly with the right tools and the right spacing, but with 4 other women. So that sort of encompasses that collective agency aspect of working together in a group, you're stronger together, as well as access to knowledge and information, and being able to do things the right way. So I loved this activity. It was very, very cool. I hope to sort of repeat it again with a little bit more like of a rigorous approach, because it was all very like impromptu. But it produced some really interesting things, and it was cool to see things that they were drawing and mentioning or depicting in their drama were reflected also in the framework that I was using. So a lot of the quotes that emerged from these focus groups, a lot of it was, again, around the changing role of women in the household, the women's overall breadwinner, but that men these days don't make decisions. It's you, the women, to make decisions, and even you are going with that decision you have made alone. The men will just wake up and go to the center, like town center, and even going to the center, he will go and take alcohol. So this is starting to allude to the fact that there is a rampant male alcohol abuse program in this, male alcohol abuse problem in this community that is impacting women directly, as well as themselves. And then the backlash against the changing roles. For the issue of tree planting, there's no men coming to help, one woman was saying. Men say, hey, you think you can manage, you try. So kind of saying, alluding to this male backlash of, you think you can manage to do this all on your own? Like, well, let's see you do it, and I'm not going to help because you've told me that you think you can do it. So let me see you try. And it's very much not from a place of support. This also gets a little bit to the autonomy of women, and that most of the needs of the household now fall solely on the women's shoulders, including the financial needs. So when Kajani actually came out with this program of tree planting, the women felt like it's going to be a long-term solution for their economic needs. Trees have a much longer time period for growth than crops, obviously. So a lot of people were viewing it as a savings account. They invest now in planting the trees, and when they're ready in 5 to 8 years for harvesting, that they know they can rely on that income versus the seasonal crops that are much more temperamental when it comes to the changing weather patterns and the fluctuating market prices, is much less reliable for them to count on. It was interesting to see some collective agency quotes emerge. So collective agency, again, being women are stronger together in a group. But during the male focus group, there was one particular guy was talking about how the groups are actually acting like a rope to tie the women to the community so that they didn't wander off and elope and get pregnant and then come back. And the group has rules which imposes control over the women who misbehave. This just like jumped out at me because it was actually a negative piece of collective agency and women being together as a group. The other men in this focus group quickly jumped in to say, like, that's not the main point of the groups. There are like a lot of positives to them, but that it was something that was helping as a control mechanism. And again, there's more likely to be more women in a home. They were saying women should not just be moving around randomly, keep them in groups as a control mechanism. So all of this kind of led me to a new term of hegemonic masculinities, especially when looking at the male alcohol abuse and the changing gender norms, is that men are having a lot of mental health struggles, which is manifesting in unhealthy coping mechanisms, including alcohol abuse. So men are passing through difficult moments, stress, thinking about the future, how you're going to afford a future without having money, stressed about what they're going to leave for their children. You don't want to leave a bill, you want to leave a will. And those stressful moments went down when this person started engaging with Kijani because he knows he's planning for his future, which was previously a little bit uncertain. So that was like a very impactful quote of how men are dealing with their changing gender norms, but also the difficulties of just living in a perpetual cycle of poverty. And then the Vale Village chief during the key informant interview was talking about one of the issues his community is facing is that young men are getting really drunk. And that a lot of that is because of the tradition of a bride price. So in Uganda, when you get married, you have to pay the bride price to the bride's family in order to like take her as your wife. And it's normally like astronomically unaffordable for most rural Ugandans. So you might find that you get a wife, but she's taken away because you can't afford the bride price, and then you're left by yourself. This was also exacerbated by COVID due to a lot of halt in economic activities and a lack of income. Just as an aside, in the last few weeks, we have a security guard that we've hired at my house just to like guard the house at night. And his wife was taken away during COVID back to her family, and he was left with his 3 kids by himself because he was not able to pay the bride price while he wasn't working during COVID lockdown. So this is very much a common thing that happens and is something that is creating a lot of stress for the men in the community due to the traditional gender norms. And then it's affecting their household relationships as well, as they have these unhealthy coping mechanisms, especially alcohol abuse. Sometimes men will just say, today we'll go and clear the garden, but he won't go. It's the woman to go alone, including the children. He'll stay at home or just go and take alcohol. If you don't go, he won't even beat you, but then you'll be thinking, what will my children and I eat tomorrow? And that'll force you to go to the garden, even if you don't want. So it's a lot of women, again, shouldering the entire responsibility for the household alone. There was some interesting quotes about time allocation and how that's leading to improvements in household relationships. Mostly that there was so much work to do with tree planting that they didn't have time to fight, which I thought was an interesting quote. They have very little time for disagreements, and I think this speaks again to having something to look forward to. They knew that they were planting trees, they'd have a future income, and they want to cooperate rather than fight. And then again, it's an uneven distribution of financial decisions and priorities among the men and women in the household. A lot of men were taking their money and using it for themselves, mostly to buy alcohol, whereas women were using it to pay for food and for school fees. So again, the women are sort of now the main breadwinners for the family. Okay, these are just a lot of quotes about alcohol abuse, but I don't know how I'm doing on time, so I might sort of skip through them, but basically it's a big problem, and the women wish that the men would stop, and they are not happy about it, and they want help. They want a shared responsibility in the household, things like that. So all of this sort of led to a really interesting discussion on the gender division of labor within the activities that Kajani does with the community. So the initial clearing of land, especially clearing of land for the nursery, is usually done by men. It's the first thing that's done. It's usually when there's the most excitement among the group and the community about the activities. However, potting, which is this, is a little bit less exciting and is typically done by women and women only. You'll notice here that everyone's sitting with the pots, which are those black plastic bags filled with soil. They're hand stuffed each time, and they have to do about 50,000 of them to support their nursery. So all of it's done sitting down. And there are some quotes, I think here. Oh, no. There's some quotes about sitting down is for women and not for men. And because potting takes place sitting down, that all of the potting then falls on the women. As well as all the nursery maintenance. Like you have to weed and water and, take care of the seedlings for 2 months. And most of that was done by women. The actual planting of those seedlings is again mostly done by women, with some men participating and the desire for more men to participate, whereas the actual harvesting of trees after they're mature enough to be used for charcoal production is done by men, and the actual charcoal production itself is done by men with just a few women participating. So as you can see, sort of, I guess I did this upside down, but what would be considered the lower nodes of the value chain of the clearing, potting, nursery maintenance, and planting, which is also the most labor intensive, is done by women, whereas the harvesting of the trees and the charcoal production, which is the top of the value chain as far as, entering the charcoal market, is done by men. And that's also where the economic and financial payoff is. So this is something Kajani is very cognizantly trying to plan around to ensure that we're not perpetuating this cycle of women doing all the work and men taking all the money. And that it was very gratifying to hear that the tree planting is providing more hope for the future, things like that. People are very proud of it. It's creating a lot of pride in one's work. And they know that they're especially able to have something for their family in the future, their children. So all of this to say, some preliminary conclusions of this research is that an approach to women's empowerment that does not include men, will simply just not work. If we were not examining men in this activity, just looking at women, we would have missed a lot of the hegemonic masculinities and male alcohol abuse, as well as the backlash against women's empowerment that was being seen in the community. And that has a direct impact on women, obviously. And that unintended consequences may inherently end up decreasing their empowerment. A very typical side effect of a lot of development activities is an increase of time burden. So as we saw several sides back, women are less empowered when it comes, or have a lower adequacy when it comes to work balance. They have a lot more things to do in a day. So there's a big practice of a lot of NGOs saying, oh, we're going to target women to participate in all these activities, and they're going to meet 3 times a week and come to these 2-hour-long trainings and blah, 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 blah. Women don't have time for that a lot. So it's actually becoming more of a burden and having negative unintended consequences. Additionally, the household decision-making as an indicator does have to be assessed in more of a cultural context and needs to be verified outside of self-reporting. So while I didn't touch on this too much in this presentation, joint household decision-making is a huge indicator for empowerment. So the ability for a female and male head of household to make decisions together on what they're going to buy or how they're going to spend their money or what they're going to plant, things like that. However, a research study was done in actually the bordering district to where I did my work that used the same questions from the ProWIA with a community, and saw that the survey showed that there was pretty equal decision-making power. However, qualitative data, mostly participatory, participant observation work with the same households showed that the local understanding of a joint decision was the male head of household informing the wife or the female head of household of the decision and her not disagreeing with it. So it would be like, hey, we're going to do this today. And silence was seen as agreement. Saying okay was seen as agreement, but there was no solicitation for input. There was no discussion. It was the man telling the woman what was going to be happening that day or how they were going to be spending their money. But those same decisions had been reported in the survey as joint decision-making. So that is like definitely something to take with a grain of salt, especially in this context. And that's something I completely left out. I'm so sorry. Northern Uganda is a post-conflict zone. So from 1990 to about 2008, 99% of the population of Northern Uganda was actually displaced into IDP camps, or essentially refugee camps. There was a massive conflict that went on with the Lord's Resistance Army. If anyone remembers Joseph Kony and Invisible Children campaign, that took place in Northern Uganda, and pretty much everyone between the age of like 25 and up has very, very vivid memories of that happening. The majority of boys between the age of 10 and 20 were abducted as child soldiers and forced to commit horrible atrocities. So economic development and just development in general that takes place in a post-conflict zone has to address mental health, because a lot of this sort of male alcohol abuse was coming a lot from mental health challenges that just aren't being addressed. One of the questions I asked in my key informant interview with the male village chief was, like, what does this community like need? What do you guys want? If you could have one thing, what would it be? And he said a mental health counselor. There's only one certified psychologist for a population of 1.4 million in Northern Uganda. So it's a massive need, and it clearly has effects on also women's empowerment and development in general. Lots of questions still to ask for my research and moving forward, but how does like the apathy of men impact women's empowerment? What role does mental health and the effects of poor mental health, like alcohol abuse, play in development programming that's targeting women's empowerment? And then looking at seed to charcoal value chain, what are the gender dynamics of this? So I do have some exciting next steps, aside from presenting my field practicum report in 6 weeks. I applied for and was given the Marianne Schmink Innovation Award, which is exciting because she's on this call and I haven't met her, but I'm very excited about it, to develop a flip book with Pangea Publishing, which is a Ugandan-based publishing and creative agency that specializes in culturally grounded storytelling. So we are using that award to develop a series of flip books, partnered with Kajani and Pangea, to have culturally relevant and grounded material to use in training with our extension agents, to use in the community that speaks to both the value of tree planting, but also women's empowerment in those activities. And it's shown to be very effective in other areas in increasing women's engagement and changing norms, but in a positive way, and addressing sort of some of that backlash that we've been seeing. It's very exciting about that. We use those materials to train and sensitize Kajani's extension workers on gender issues, as well as conduct a landscape analysis of access to mental health services and counseling, just to sort of start the process of seeing what's available. Whoa, okay, so thank you very much. I think that is the end of my presentation. This is my email and my WhatsApp. Again, I'm not in the States, so if you text that number, it might not come through, but if you WhatsApp that number, I will definitely get it. And thank you very much.